In 2001, Dick Cheney was often called the most powerful vice president in history, or more infamously as the Darth Vader of George Bush, and was at the height of his political prestige and one of the most important people in the world. After his controversial tenure ended and is no longer in the limelight, we have to ask, where is Dick Cheney now? Richard Bruce Cheney was born on January 30th, 1941, which, to give some context, is the same year the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Born in Lincoln, Nebraska as the son of Richard Herbert Cheney, a soil conservation agent, and Marjorie Loren Dickey Cheney, who was actually a softball star in the 1930s. Although born in Nebraska, he grew up in Casper, Wyoming, and in 1964 he married his childhood sweetheart, Lynn Ann Vinson. He must have worked very hard in school because he was eventually accepted into Yale on a full-ride scholarship, but struggled with poor grades and eventually had to drop out. After this dropout, he had an infamous stint working as a power lineman in Wyoming, which, if you don't know, are the people who essentially string up power wires. During this time, he was a famously heavy drinker and ended up with multiple DUIs, which in turn he later credited as kind of a wake-up call for him. Cheney eventually did stop drinking and began attending the University of Wyoming, receiving a bachelor's and master's in political science. Cheney was also a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he dropped out without completing. From here, it was honestly a straight shot upwards for Cheney. In 1969, he took a job under the then Congressman Bill Steiga. Because of his work under him, he was recommended to take a job as an assistant to Congressman Donald Rumsfeld. From there, it was straight into the White House, working as the youngest chief of staff in history for the Gerald Ford administration, which transitioned eventually into campaign manager for Ford's 1976 presidential campaign. From 1979 to 1989, Cheney, a Republican, went on to represent Wyoming in the House of Representatives, eventually going on to lead the House Minority and become the whip. In 1989, the incoming president, George H.W. Bush, nominated Cheney to the office of Secretary of Defense after his first choice Senator John G. Tower was rejected. His tenure was a particularly active one, overseeing the invasion of Panama, Operation Desert Storm, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Cheney greatly valued his time working in the Pentagon, later stating that this was the position that really stood out. After Bush Sr. lost his re-election bid in 1992, Cheney went on to become the chairman of Halliburton, one of the largest oil exploration and development companies in the world at the time. Having almost zero business experience, Cheney might have seemed a bit of an odd choice as CEO, but what he lacked in business knowledge, he more than made up for with connections. It's alleged that Cheney made over $44 million during his time working at Halliburton, and much of his net worth is from his time working there. Also, in a case of what ifs, he was apparently contemplating running for president in 1996, but eventually decided against it. In the early 2000s, then Governor George W. Bush requested Cheney head his vice presidential search committee, but surprising some in his circle, he eventually asked Cheney himself to join as his running mate. Making a stylish exit, Cheney reportedly reached an agreement with Halliburton to retire with a package estimated at around $20 million. From the offset, there were signs that the typical president-vice president relationship would not be upheld between Bush and Cheney. Dan Quayle, the former vice president, recalled in a meeting attempting to brief Cheney on the vice presidential duties, to which Cheney replied, "I have a different understanding with the president." This arrangement essentially made Cheney a surrogate chief of staff, as well as becoming a key foreign, military, and energy policy advisor to the president. Cheney became one of, if not the most powerful vice president in American history, and expanded the very power of the vice presidency itself, even as some critics would later claim, came at the price of exerting unconstitutional powers. All this sounds very dramatic, with many at the time describing Cheney as a type of shadow president to Bush, which is where his infamous Darth Vader status stems from. That all being said, it appears as if Bush and Cheney were mostly in agreement with many policies, with the key exception of two very public disagreements between the two. One such disagreement came in the form of the Scooter Libby scandal. In 2003, Cheney's chief of staff, Louis Scooter Libby, was caught up in leaking the identity of Valerie Plame, a covert CIA agent. Eventually, Libby was convicted on felony charges for lying during the investigation, and Cheney heavily lobbied George W. to grant Libby a full presidential pardon for the duration of his tenure, liking Libby to, quote, a soldier on the battlefield. Just to close off this thread very neatly, as a side note, Libby was eventually pardoned, but by Donald Trump in 2018. Another disagreement came to light during the 2004 presidential election, where the sexual orientation of Cheney's daughter, Mary, as a lesbian became a source of public attention. Both Dick and his wife Lynn disagreed with the federal amendments against same-sex marriage, believing that it should be a matter best left to the states themselves to decide, which stood in stark contrast to Bush's support for a federal ban on gay marriage. Alright, so before I close this section, we have got to at least mention the famous shooting accident in 2006, which has borne the brunt of many jokes and satire, even surprisingly up to 2023. While hunting, Cheney accidentally shot an attorney, Harry Whittington, a then 78-year-old Texas attorney, in the face, who later suffered what has been described as a minor heart attack due to the shooting. Both Cheney and Whittington, both to this day, called the incident an accident. I don't want to get too bogged down here with theories and the like, but the major takeaway from this, aside from all the satire, was damage to Cheney's popularity in the polls. Right, so most people know him for his tenure in the White House, but what about afterward? After serving as one of the most controversial and divisive VPs of all time, Cheney stayed active in politics, which isn't really surprising because that's honestly all he had ever known. He was a pivotal figure in Mitt Romney's presidential run, even using his own home to host a fundraiser which apparently netted millions of dollars. After Romney lost, Cheney was extremely critical of Obama. In the beginning of Obama's presidency, he was especially vocal in his distaste of their foreign and military policy, stating in 2015, "I vacillate between the various theories I've heard, but if you had somebody as a president who wanted to take America down, who wanted to fundamentally weaken our position in the world and reduce our capacity to influence events, turn our back on our allies, and encourage our adversaries, it would look exactly like what Barack Obama's doing. I think his actions are constituted, in my mind, those of the worst president we've ever had." Shots fired. Now, unlike Bush, it's not clear if Cheney in recent years has been pursuing artistic dreams. He has, however, been a prolific author, publishing a number of different books. His first book was entitled In My Time, a personal and political memoir, and released in 2011. It portrays Cheney's account of his time in office, from 9/11, the war on terrorism, the 2001 war in Afghanistan, and enhanced interrogation techniques. It went on to become a New York Times bestseller, but received mostly mixed reviews, with the Washington Post Roberts Kaser stating, "If this book was read by an intelligent person who spent the past 10 years, say, on Mars, she would have no idea that Dick Cheney was the vice president in one of the most hapless American administrations of modern times." There are hints, to be sure, that things did not always go swimmingly under President George W. Bush and Cheney, but those are surrounded by triumphalist accounts of events that many readers and future historians are unlikely to consider triumphs. His second book was released in 2015 and was a bit of a stranger beast. Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America tracks the history of U.S. foreign policy from past to present. Cheney portrays the United States as a defender of freedom throughout the world since World War II and draws heavily from the notion of American exceptionalism. The book continues Cheney's criticisms of Obama and Hillary Clinton's foreign policies and offers solutions in the form of a more prominent America on the world stage. An excerpt of the book, co-authored by Liz Cheney, sums up the major themes quite nicely. The United States has been essential to the preservation and progress of freedom, and those who lead us in the years ahead must remind us, as Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Reagan did, the special role we play. We are, in fact, exceptional. As a brief aside, I gotta say that going through the Amazon reviews for this book was completely fascinating. Now, this idea of American exceptionalism might seem like an odd take to have years after his tenure as vice president, but one can only imagine that with the then upcoming 2016 presidential election, Cheney was hoping that his ideologies might be upheld with the next president. Now, Cheney has had a bit of a checkered relationship with Donald Trump. In 2016, Cheney told CNN he would support Donald Trump at a time when many in the Republican leadership were very hesitant to do so. Although he did give his nominal support, at least initially, he was equally as vocal in his distaste for Trump's views on immigration, when at the time, Trump was calling for a, quote, total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until lawmakers can, quote, figure out what is going on. Now, things with Donald Trump eventually turned sour, and this is in large part probably due to Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney, the daughter of Dick Cheney, went on to succeed her father as representative for Wyoming. Now, because we can't go into full detail on the entirety of the Liz Cheney versus Donald Trump saga, we're just gonna have to summarize. Essentially, Liz Cheney was one of the 10 Republicans to vote to impeach Trump, and since then has been very vocal of him. Dick Cheney, for his part, completely supports his daughter, and on the one-year anniversary of the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack, Cheney joined his daughter Liz at the Capitol in the remembrance event. In a rare show, many of his old rivals on the Hill would come up to shake his hand. Most recently, he appeared in a 2022 video where he aggressively went for Trump, calling him not only, quote, a threat to our republic, but also a coward. So that about brings us up to current events. In sum, Dick Cheney is a politician through and through, and it's no surprise that even in 2023, at 82 years old, he is still wheelin' and dealin' in the political arena, not only for his daughter's sake, but probably to a larger extent for the benefit of his legacy. Thanks so much for watching this. It's my first video on the channel, and it was a really interesting process. I hate to say this, but since this is my first video ever, please like, and possibly, if you want to see more, subscribe. It'll definitely help me get this channel off the ground and make more videos like it. If you want to do more to support me, please check the Patreon link below. Also, not entirely sure what I'll do next, so if you have suggestions, I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.